we saw in part 1, there was a diverse migration heading west. By 1890, over 500,000 African Americans had moved west of the Mississippi. These migrants worked the land as farmers, became cowboys, working with cattle drives, and buffalo soldiers whose job it was to protect new settlers from Indian attacks. The vast majority of settlers were young men. Families ventured the migration as well, but it was incredibly difficult and hard for women and young children. Newly arrived immigrants from Northern Europe and Canada also made their way west, as well as large numbers of Germans, Scandinavians, and Irish. The U.S. Census Bureau recorded that in 1850 there was barely 18,000 Scandinavians in the United States. By 1900, there were 1.1 million. More than 200,000 Chinese arrived between 1876 and 1890. Exodusters, blacks exiting from the bigotry and racism of the South, made their way west as well. These migrants were not out of the reach of the federal government, though. The federal government built military posts in the West. These posts served many purposes, including protection of settlers from hardship and Indian attack, maintaining peace between Indian tribes, and serving as a trading post for miners, fur trappers, and new migrants heading west. These forts were built in Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Wyoming, Arizona, Colorado, and California. These forts were critical for the success of westward expansion. During this same time, many hundreds of thousands of Hispanics had settled in the Southwest prior to the United States seizing the land during the Mexican War. The war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and granted American citizenship to those who stayed in the United States, for those who wanted it. Or they may maintain their Mexican citizenship, or they could leave the country and go to Mexico. Those who stayed often found they were not granted the rights and guarantees of others under the Constitution, and found their culture and way of life under attack much like the Plain Indians. As stated in Part 1, the United States took it upon itself to impose American values onto the continent. The term we use to describe this takeover of the West is manifest destiny. The notion was termed by John O. Sullivan in 1845 in the United States' magazine Democratic Review. The term connoted there existed a divine will for expansion and domination of the continent. Of course, land developers, railroad magnates, and others capitalized on the notion of westward migration. It was believed that Americans were destined to rule the continent. This belief gave Americans the mindset that they were to govern any groups of indigenous group in the way of westward expansion. Some of this land was already occupied with settlers from Western Europe and Asia, along with Native Americans and Mexicans. Expansion would come at a high price for all those involved. Those that did make it west, life for a settler was difficult. These settlers were called sodbusters, due to the fact that there was little timber to build houses, and these settlers usually used sod and mud along with thatched roofs for building materials. This caused particular problems when it rained or snowed. There was a problem with lice and rodents as well. Swarms of locusts and other crop-eating insects, which covered the ground, were sometimes 6 to 12 inches deep. They settled mainly in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. The weather and the environment were difficult for settlers. Seasons could be either too rainy or too dry, and low rainfall made crop cultivation difficult, and the only source of water was irrigation, which was virtually non-existent. It was not until the Newlands Reclamation Act of 1902 that dams were built to facilitate irrigation for growing crops. Without sufficient irrigation, the farmer was dry farming. Some were able to use windmill technology to draw water, but this was usually too expensive for settlers. Farmers always faced the threat of debt and the banks foreclosing on the property. Though land was free under the Homestead Act, farm tools, seed, lumber, livestock, wells, fencing, fertilizer were not cheap. Farmers had to borrow from the banks with a promise to repay after the harvest. In return, banks charged high interest rates. This threat was coupled with railroad prices for moving goods, and the price of crops or machinery was extraordinarily high at the time. With more settlers moving west to farm, more crops were on the market and prices would fall, making it difficult for one to be a successful farmer. As farm equipment became more plentiful, many farmers still could not afford the chilled plow, or hay mowers, manure spreaders, or threshing machines designed to make farming less arduous. Many who planned on farming their own plot went to work on bonanza farms of 20,000 or more acres, which could afford the prices for farm machinery. The typical cost for the startup of a family farm was approximately $1,000. Even with free lands, settlers could not afford the price for farming equipment. But farming was not the only attraction. Many moved west to mine for gold, silver, and copper. Stories of the 49ers mining for gold in California was plentiful. There were other mines outside of California which yielded profits for the owners. Many who planned on mining ended up working for mine owners. The Comstock lode yielded more than $300 million in silver in Virginia City, Nevada, in the first 20 years of mining it. Arizona and Montana yielded mines filled with copper, which was in need for electrical advancement and telegraph communication. By the late 1970s, surface mining no longer yielded value, and heavy equipment, too expensive for the average miner, was needed to continue mining. So if farming did not work and mining did not work, you would also come across a different type of individual. Because railroad terminals were located in Abilene, Wichita, and Dodge City, Kansas, cattle drives from Texas made that their destination using the Chisholm Trail. Cowboys would receive their pay when they delivered the cattle. Industrious men like cattleman Joseph McCoy built hotels, banks, stockyards, and more to support the cattlemen and allow them to spend their newly earned wages. The typical cowboy, of which there was 40,000 of them roaming the plains from 1865 to 1885, was a single man in his 20s. 1/3 of them were Hispanic or African American, and the instruments used by the cowboys, the saddles, lassos, chaps, and lariats, were all borrowed from Mexico. When barbed wire was invented in 1873 by Joseph Gibbon, it changed the West significantly. Until the development of barbed wire, cattle could graze along the trail from Texas. With borders come small conflicts that would erupt throughout the plains between ranchers. Once the settled lands were fenced off, in came capital investors from the east who bought land, built ranches, and expanded rail lines, which brought an end to the cattle drives and profits for the capitalist investors. Outside of the Indian Wars, most of the violence in the West occurred in mining towns where resources were short and money, liquor, and disappointment were all present in vast quantities. When owners of large ranches used barbed wire to fence off their land, fence-cutting wars erupted. Eventually in Texas, the legislature had to outlaw fence cutting and force ranchers to take their fences off public land. When those driving cattle would cut a fence to feed or water the herd, they would often abscond with some of the ranch's cattle, along with their own. That was known as cattle rustling. Finally, the army was brought in to keep the peace. So far, we have farmers, miners, cowboys, and entrepreneurs in the West. There were few women in these outside towns, and those who ventured to go to those remote locations went as prostitutes. Many of these women became quite adept entrepreneurs and opened their own brothels. Other occupations would be women who supported their husbands by working in dry goods stores in these mining towns. But as the rich moved in from the east, these women focused on organizing schools and churches, civic clubs, and other programs to promote family values. In response to this, Congress passed the Comstock Law, which prohibited lewd or lascivious literature to be sent through the mail, as well as the Page Act, prohibiting transportation of women to the United States for prostitution. As the following PBS special shows us, there was more than farmers, miners, cowboys, natives, soldiers, and entrepreneurs heading west. The PBS program is looking at the history of indulgences out west. It just so happens we are currently in debate over one of these western state laws. So the video will go past western expansion, but highlights how the history is connected to modern times.
In the mid-1800s, America was expanding rapidly into the West. We were industrializing. We were fighting a national crisis over slavery. And America, in many ways, was a wide open country.
People associated the frontier with freedom, with not really having a lot of laws regulating social behavior.
There were not strong rules or regulations, and sometimes it felt like anything goes.
The West was always a safety valve for the East in American history. If you got behind on creditors back east, you just went west. Committed a crime back east, robbery, even murder, just go west. So we had more than our fair share of undesirables out here in the gold rush.
After the prospectors arrived, the next people to come to get rich were the whiskey sellers, because saloons popped up in the Pikes Peak region almost immediately.
The very early saloons that started out in the West, in most places in the mining camps, were very primitive affairs to begin with. They might be just a barrel with a plank over it, and somebody selling alcohol from the back of a wagon. A lot of mining camps were transitory. The people might be there one day, they might be gone the next day if the strike gave out. So this way the bartender could throw his barrel and plank in the back of his wagon and move on to the next promising mining camps.
The saloon is a important center of social activity if you're a man. That's where you could go to find a job, you could get your mail there.
A place of society, it was a place to meet your friends, to hear the news.
You go there to kind of meet other people, kind of relax after a hard day in the mines.
If you were an immigrant, you could go to an immigrant saloon to read papers in your home language. You could get a free lunch.
So the saloon is a really, really important part of social activity in Denver and other mining towns across Colorado.
And of course, everything was lubricated with whiskey.
Whiskey is the drink of Colorado in the late 19th century. Whiskey is very valuable. It keeps well. A bottle of whiskey can last a very, very long time, if you don't drink it first.
Whiskey could be either made on the premises or it could come from back east. A lot of the whiskey was actually adulterated. It might be watered down in the saloon. It might be actually made in the saloon. And you never really quite knew what you were getting when you went in and ordered a drink. There were a lot of bogus boozes that were made. They'd start out with a barrel of grain alcohol, start adding water, perhaps even river water or creek water, and add various other things like creosote or tobacco or strychnine, or pepper, and all sorts of things. There are many recipes for making whiskey.
Whiskey was a major part of the American economy in the early 1800s. Farmers who grew grain found that whiskey was an easily transportable and durable commodity that they could ship a long way to market. And so whiskey was considered a form of currency in the United States.
And a lot of this unfortunate bogus whiskey went to the Indians also for trading.
Whiskey had been used as medicine since the Middle Ages. Physicians had realized that alcohol had antiseptic and analgesic properties. It dulled pain, it killed germs, it kept areas sterile. Civil War medics kept whiskey in their packs as one of their main go-to medicines for wounded soldiers. It was prescribed for tuberculosis. It was prescribed to treat pneumonia. It was prescribed to treat high blood pressure. And it was seen as this drug that cured a variety of ills and could be used to treat the symptoms of practically anything.
Alcohol consumption is so centered around the saloon, and that's a very, very male space. Respectable women didn't really go in saloons. If they drank at home, and they might drink wine, or they might drink patent medicines, which have a really potent mix of questionable ingredients like laudanum and cannabis, and other ingredients that we later find are actually really dangerous.
Patent medicines were what we would call just over-the-counter drugs today. They mostly consisted of a large percentage of alcohol. These had various other additives. In a lot of cases, they were natural, so-called natural remedies such as leaves and roots. But in addition, they might contain things like opium, morphine. Some had cocaine, and they had a lot of other addictive substances. So these things really packed a wallop. And if somebody believed in dosing themselves with a patent medicine, say a couple of teaspoons a day, they were getting a pretty good jolt of narcotic and alcoholic substances.
These so-called patent medicines were positioned to cure all kinds of ills. Anything that ailed you, you could find a patent medicine that was supposed to cure. And so drugs were pretty freely available. If you had an opium habit, you could drink laudanum, which was a mixture of alcoholic spirits and opium that was used as a general cure-all for practically anything. It cured aches and pains, it cured fevers. It was used to treat the symptoms of cholera and dysentery. It was used for feminine complaints. And because it was highly addictive in time, you were drinking laudanum to cure your desire for laudanum.
A lot of times people would take that just to relieve any kind of pain that they had, including giving it to their children, perhaps teething children. There were syrups and elixirs and things like that They contain an extremely high content of opium and morphine, and that would keep them quiet. In fact, some women who couldn't afford a babysitter would give their child, a young child, say a year-old, big dose of one of these soothing elixirs in the morning, go off to work, and the child would sleep all day.
And so children at a very early age either became addicted or sometimes they died of overdoses because their parents cared.
Some of these concoctions may have tasted pretty awful. They could add things like rose hip syrup that would disguise the taste and make it taste a lot better. Women would use this, ones who thought alcohol was terrible to drink. They often were swigging laudanum in the back room. They might have a bottle hidden behind the groceries in the kitchen. Women were not accepted as big drinkers. This was considered socially inappropriate. So they could use laudanum as a substitute and not think they were drinking, even though it had a very high percentage of alcohol. Probably about 70%, I believe, of women at that time were taking some form of laudanum. After the pioneers arrived and these vices, so to speak, came out here, most of the towns ended up having some kind of what we would call an opium den.
Opium was freely available in medicines of the time, but the stigmatized version of opium was what became known as joss. These are pellets or buttons of opium that are placed in pipes and smoked, and the Chinese introduced what became known as joss houses. These are places you could go. You didn't have to be Chinese. They were very often, but not always, in the Chinese neighborhoods in Denver or Fairplay or other communities in Colorado. And you could purchase a button of opium and you could smoke it, and it would just blow your mind.
You could really just take a vacation from life. You could be gone for 3 hours, or you can be gone for 3 days.
It would relax you, it would detach you, it would bring you down. And it became fairly common for people to go into Chinese communities and find the opium dens.
Victorian literature became very sensationalistic. They described these opium dens as being wonderful places and very lavish furnishings, silks hanging around, beautiful women and so forth. Unfortunately, the reality wasn't quite that good. These places tend to be more what we would call a dive today.
There was a counter where you could buy your opium. They would give you a private room or just a berth where you could lie down, you could relax, there might be music playing, and you would light up. The company around you might be prostitutes or gamblers or Chinese laborers or very sophisticated society people. They would all find this high in the democracy of opium.
Opium's a narcotic, and it would put these people to sleep. So the stories of wild orgies in the opium dens were really not true, because after having one pipe of opium, the people would just pass out for a couple of hours.
Most of the opium users in Colorado were Anglo, but the people who were blamed for opium use were the Chinese.
They were the ones who brought it to this country, to the West Coast, as a recreational drug.
And the Chinese were scapegoated. The fact that there were joss houses in Chinese communities was often used as an excuse to drive the Chinese out of town. By 1880, there was a national hysteria against the Chinese.
There was such hostility towards the Chinese in Colorado and the West because, well, they're very industrious and hardworking.
And they were resented because they seemed so alien to American culture.
And in 1880, a young man died. The coroner said that he died from typhoid, but he said some of this could have been caused or could have been linked to the fact that he took opium for pain. And so once the newspapers got hold of this, the headlines just flared. And this, of course, roused the population more and more, and there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment.
On Halloween of 1880, a fight broke out in a pool hall in what's today lower downtown Denver between Chinese and non-Chinese, and it spread into a brawl throughout the city. The brawl was ultimately fed by anti-Chinese hysteria and by a desire to close down the joss houses in Denver's Chinatown.
Well, now we have whites who rampage to the Chinese district. They are beating Chinese in the street. They lynch an elderly Chinese man from a lamppost. They're looting and burning Chinese businesses and homes.
They destroyed the joss houses and drove the Chinese out of the neighborhood.
What saves the Chinese from annihilation? They fled to the brothels. We have newspaper accounts. The girls in the brothels taken in the Chinese, holding back the mobs with cocked revolvers, waving champagne bottles over that. Yeah, you just come across that threshold. So if it wasn't for the girls in the brothels, we'd have a lot more loss of life.
The mayor called out the fire department and he called out the police department. They were unable to do anything about it at that time. And finally the militia had to be called in, and the whole thing settled down after a couple of days.
The anti-Chinese riot of 1880 did very little to stop the opium trade in Denver. Joss houses reopened almost immediately. It wasn't until the late 19-teens when federal regulations began to clamp down on the illicit opium trade and drive it underground. The Joss houses closed in the 19-teens, but they were replaced by a black market for opium and stronger opiates like heroin and morphine. Along with opium and whiskey, coca leaves were viewed in the late 1800s as another kind of medicine and stimulant.
Cocaine came from the leaves of the coca plant, which came from the Andes in South America, and then made its way up here as a medicine.
Native American people in South America had been chewing coca leaves as a mild stimulant since time out of mind. But in the 1880s, scientists learned how to distill the active ingredients of coca leaves into a powdered form that we know today as cocaine.
So it would be used rubbing on the skin, perhaps applying with a Q-tip on a bad toothache or something like that. But it also was available over the counter, and there were some manufacturers who actually supplied the whole kit and caboodle for using cocaine.
Cocaine was so much more intense, so much stronger than the coca leaves, and it was seen as a wonder drug. What disease could cocaine not cure?
Cocaine was used to stimulate repurchase of things, so you'd find cocaine inside cigarettes and so forth. That made the person feel good when they were smoking, and so they would go out and repurchase that particular product. There were also a lot of soft drinks on the market.
Coca-Cola is named after the coca leaf that was one of its original ingredients. Until the 1920s, there was some form of coca leaf in Coca-Cola. So it was ubiquitous. You could find it everywhere. But like opium and like alcohol, cocaine has addictive properties. It has a debilitating side that, when abused, can cause a lot of health problems, cause a lot of social problems. By the early 20th century, Americans began to realize that we need to kind of step back from drugs like cocaine or opium. And we have to figure out how to regulate this better so that we're not creating overdoses, we're not creating bad domestic situations, we're not creating opportunities for abuse.
You could put anything on a bottle and claim it cures everything from cancer to baldness. Put a little oil in there, tastes like a medicine. A little alcohol gives them a buzz. If you want a surefire bestseller, you put a little rat poison in there, strychnine. People would drink it and start getting cramps and go, it's working. It's taking the poison out of my system.
In the 1900s, the party was over. In 1906, the federal government passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which required medicine makers to label the ingredients in their medicines. Now you could find out for sure just how much cocaine or opium you were taking. And when people realized how much they were taking, they cut back very quickly.
If you were addicted to something, then you were addicted, and there wasn't much you could do about it anyway. But it was an attempt by the government to try and at least put more information out there so somebody could make an informed choice.
In 1914, the federal government passed the Harrison Drug Act. This was an act designed to regulate drug use. It wasn't designed to prohibit drug use, but federal law enforcement officials used it to crack down on physicians who were prescribing to addicts in order to maintain their addiction.
In fact, even when some of the over-the-counter sales of morphine and opium and other drugs was banned, people could still get them. What it did was make it a bit more expensive for them to get them, but I don't think it really cured the problem. It didn't take away the source of drugs. You could always get a prescription from your doctor, or you could just buy it on the black market.
And so the illicit drug trade really begins in the 19-teens.
Beer came out west with the German beer makers after the Civil War.
Some of the European breweries, like Bass, actually did send beer to the United States, and it made its way out to some of the mountain towns. The cost was high and the quality was low, so you had to really want that beer.
Beer in many ways is a much more complex drink than whiskey or other distilled spirits. It has a lot more ingredients. It has water, it has yeast, it has hops, which are actually really hard to come by in Colorado in the mid-19th century, and you have some sort of malted grain. And it's very fragile. Unless you pasteurize it, it will go bad very quickly.
Imagine loading up your wagon with a whole bunch of kegs. A barrel of beer is 31 gallons of liquid. That's really heavy. That's asking a lot of your ox team at the time. Come across the plains, hauling all of that, and it's not going to last you all that long.
Beer goes bad so quickly that it's much better to produce beer locally than whiskey. So in the summer of 1859, Frederick Solomon and John Good found the Rocky Mountain Brewery. And that's Denver's first brewery.
Legend has it that John Good brought the first hops to Denver, and that's how he earned his partnership. He brought them across the plains in an ox cart.
So they start brewing and they celebrate by giving Rocky Mountain News editor William Byers the first bottle of their first beer. One local critic called it, quote, innocent of hops, unquote. It didn't really have a hoppy flavor. So they're mostly selling it in kegs or in buckets or in whatever container they used to local saloons where they would get it on draft.
The kegs in the 19th century were wooden barrels.
Because they're not able to pasteurize their beer, this is really the only way that you can get their product until people start pasteurizing it and putting it to dark glass bottles to keep it from light.
And some of these saloons were going through 10 kegs a day. Beer was about a nickel, and that was just the right price for an awful lot of people in Colorado at the time.
So 1859 is when we see Colorado's first brewery. But it's not for another decade or so that we see the brewery that most Americans associate with Colorado, and that's the Coors Brewery. So in 1872, Adolf Coors immigrates to Colorado from Germany.
You have this teenage boy, they've been an apprentice and a German brewer. Well, there's a draft for the Prussian army, and this little draft dodger will end up sneaking aboard a ship. He's discovered halfway across the Atlantic Ocean, but rather than throwing him out, they make him promise to pay when he gets here. And Adolf Coors arrives in America.
And he actually first sets up shop in Denver, but he and another German immigrant, Jacob Schwaler, start looking for a different brewery site.
He spent his weekends, once he got here, scouting around for a place to open a brewery.
They find a site in Golden near Clear Creek that is actually the site of a tannery at one point. And they essentially start brewing what they call Schwaler and Coors Golden Lager. Eventually, Coors buys out Schwaler and it becomes the Coors Brewing Company.
They were one of the smaller brewers when they first started.
They're not serving really large geographic markets, partially because beer goes bad really quickly, but if you're in Golden, it's essentially your local brewery. By 1880, they're producing a fair amount of beer, and they're actually starting to bottle their beer. And refrigerated rail cars that are kind of helping bring fresh produce from California, fresh meat from stockyards, they're also bringing beer to people in bottles from breweries that are much farther away. So Coors starts distributing to people throughout Colorado and throughout the interior West. Coloradans are always early adopters, so Prohibition is enacted in Colorado 4 years before the rest of the nation. Before Prohibition, there's a ton of breweries in the United States, and they're producing a lot of different types of beer. So it's actually a fairly diverse industry, but once Prohibition becomes the law of the land in Colorado in 1916, and then the United States as a whole in 1920, brewers have to adjust to a new law very quickly.
They let out their barrel rooms as storage. They had ice businesses. Almost all of them brewed some form of near beer,
Which is beer that is less than 0.5% alcohol. Coors diversified into other industries, and they had actually started doing this during World War I. They have a cement industry. The Coors family expands into real estate, and they also produce malted milk.
Coming out of Prohibition, 4 breweries survived. The first was Coors. The second was the Tivoli Union Brewery, Walters down in Pueblo, and Schneider in Trinidad.
In the Great Depression, Americans really needed a drink. And by 1933, President Roosevelt began pushing for the repeal of Prohibition. It began very slowly with a resumption of production of beer, but by the mid-1930s, state legislatures voted overwhelmingly to repeal Prohibition as a failed experiment. What America learned from Prohibition is that it's difficult to regulate social behavior on a national level.
In the 19th century, cannabis, it uses a painkiller, it uses kind of an anesthetic, and doctors like it because it's considered actually less dangerous than opiates. But cannabis as a medicine has some problems. It's really hard to dose. Cannabis is insoluble in water, so you can't make an injectable form, which is actually the most scientific way to administer drugs at the time. So you have to make a tincture, you have to make an oil out of it, or you have to kind of ingest it orally. But it's really hard to determine how much cannabis you're giving somebody. So at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, you start to see a new class of drugs coming out, aspirin. They come in pill form, you know what's in there, and it's easier to give those to your patients. So cannabis is kind of being replaced by other drugs by the early 20th century.
Drug use became more demonized. Certainly this had been true for the Chinese as far back as the 1870s and the 1880s. They had been stigmatized because of opium. In the 19-teens, Americans became more aware of cannabis use. Now, Americans have been taking cannabis and patent medicines for decades, but in the 19-teens, after the Mexican Revolution, as more Mexican immigrants began to move into the United States, they brought with them the practice of smoking cannabis, or as they called it, marijuana. And as opium was associated with the Chinese, marijuana use was associated with Mexicans. Cocaine by the 1920s became associated with African Americans. And so this connection between race and drug use became kind of a code for white Americans to find means to suppress people of different colors.
In the 1930s, this bureaucrat named Harry Anslinger, who is the head of the Federal Narcotics Bureau, starts focusing more and more on marijuana.
Marijuana became the #1 demon of the United States Narcotics Bureau. It was described as the most dangerous drug in America, or the most dangerous drug in history. In sensational article after sensational article, as the press picks up on this crusade by the Narcotics Bureau, they talk about drug slaves and drug fiends and how one puff of marijuana will inevitably lead to insanity.
So the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 is our first kind of federal law dealing with marijuana. It attempts to prohibit marijuana use through taxation. In order to buy, distribute, or even own marijuana, you have to apply for a tax stamp from the federal government. But the government didn't really want to give these stamps out. It never really intended to create a regulated marijuana industry. The goal was essentially to prohibit cannabis through making its use and sale so difficult that people would just stop. The first federal prosecution under the Marijuana Tax Act took place in Denver in 1937. Samuel Caldwell was caught selling marijuana to a guy named Moses Baca. Neither of them had a stamp, so they were prosecuted under this new federal law. Harry Anslinger came out to see the first fruits of his labor, and so we had the first federal prosecution under the first federal marijuana law. Colorado is essentially a test case for marijuana laws. And the fact that we were one of the first places where people were punished for using marijuana, and the first place to really legalize it, shows how attitudes towards marijuana have changed from the 1930s to today.
We're so far ahead of the rest of the nation in accepting recreational drug use that not everybody is comfortable with the direction that we're going.
There's still kind of a reputation that we have as being kind of this Wild West state where you can come out here and you can go around the corner and you can pick up an eighth. And so you're seeing this massive influx into Denver and other Colorado cities by people who want to join the cannabis industry. Because that's what it is now. It's an industry regulated by the state of Colorado from seed to smoke.
It is so ironic to watch how history can resemble itself over time. This was a debate we were having in the 19-teens. What kind of access should you have to drugs like marijuana? How much personal responsibility should you have to be able to use drugs? And how does that responsibility affect society? What is the cost of that responsibility? That was the debate they were having with Lydia Pinkham's tonic back in the 1800s, or the regulation of cocaine and opium in the 19-teens.
What we've learned today is that these substances are addictive, they cause social problems, and hopefully we've moved on beyond a lot of what they used to do in those days.
Drugs are not good, and they're not bad, and they're not neutral. They are what we make of them. Will we end up in a good place with how we use and regulate recreational drugs? I don't think we know. I think that's one of the exciting things about living in Colorado right now is we're living through history and we're working this out for ourselves.